In December 1975, a 24-year-old engineer named Stephen Sasson stood on the second floor of Building 28 at Kodak Park, Rochester, New York, and showed his supervisors a device he had assembled entirely from components available inside the Kodak apparatus division. It had no film, it had no shutter, it had no chemical process of any kind. It captured a black and white image on a magnetic cassette tape and displayed that image on a television screen connected by a cable. The image was 100 pixels wide and 100 pixels tall, 10,000 points of light. It took 23 seconds to record a single frame. The assembled device weighed 8 pounds. Sasson's supervisors examined the prototype. They filed the patent. They told him not to show it to anyone outside the building. 27 years later, Eastman Kodak Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York. The filing listed assets of $5.1 billion against liabilities of $6.8 billion. The company that had once employed 60,000 people in Rochester alone could not pay its debts. Every newspaper account cited the same cause: Kodak had failed to adapt to digital photography. The camera Kodak had failed to adapt to was the one its own engineer had built in its own laboratory in 1975. America built the camera that every family owned. America made the film it ran on. America lost both in a single decade. Every week, this channel tells the stories of the American companies that built the cameras and film that recorded American life and what the market did to them. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. This one begins in Rochester, New York in 1888. George Eastman was not a chemist by training. He was a bank clerk. He was born in Waterville, New York in 1854 and spent his early working years as a bookkeeper at the Rochester Savings Bank. In the evenings, he taught himself photographic chemistry from British trade journals. By 1879, he had developed a dry plate emulsion process, a method of coating glass photographic plates with a gelatin silver compound that remained sensitive to light after drying, and had filed the patent in London before submitting it in the United States. The problem Eastman was solving was the defining problem of professional photography in 1879. A photographer of that era did not carry a camera. He carried a darkroom. The wet collodion process, the standard photographic technology of the 1860s and 1870s, required that glass plates be coated with a light-sensitive chemical solution and exposed while still wet. A field photographer working the American West. A photojournalist covering a political campaign. A portrait photographer establishing a studio in a mid-sized American city. Each required a portable chemical laboratory, a tent or wagon to block the light, and the physical ability to coat, expose, and develop a glass plate within the 60-second window before the emulsion dried and became useless. The dry plate changed that equation entirely. It could be manufactured in advance, stored in a light-proof box, shipped by rail to any city in America, and exposed in the field at the photographer's convenience. Development could wait until the photographer returned to a proper laboratory. For the first time, the camera and the darkroom were separated. Eastman saw the commercial logic immediately. In 1880, he established a dry plate manufacturing operation in Rochester on the third floor of a building at 343 State Street. Rochester was not a random choice. The Genesee River provided water power for manufacturing. The Erie Canal provided distribution access to New York City and westward to Chicago and beyond. The city already supported a precision manufacturing culture. Optical instruments, scientific equipment, fine machine tools that Eastman would need as his ambitions grew beyond chemistry into hardware. In 1884, Eastman replaced glass plates with a paper-backed film that could be rolled onto a spool. In 1888, he produced the first Kodak camera, a wooden box loaded with enough rolled film for 100 exposures priced at $25, the equivalent of roughly $850 in current purchasing power. The camera was sold with a service proposition that no photographic manufacturer had previously offered. When the roll was finished, the customer mailed the entire camera back to Rochester. Kodak developed the film, printed 100 circular prints, reloaded the camera with fresh film, and returned it by mail. The slogan Eastman wrote for the 1888 advertising campaign was 4 words: "You press the button, we do the rest." It was the most consequential sentence in the history of American consumer photography. It defined the Kodak business model for the next 114 years: sell the hardware at a low margin and own the film and processing revenue for the life of every camera in the field. The camera was the entry point. The film was the business. By 1892, the Eastman Kodak Company was formally incorporated with manufacturing operations consolidated in Rochester. By 1900, the Brownie camera, a cardboard box camera priced at $1 designed to be sold to children, had made photography accessible to every American family above the poverty line. By 1910, Kodak Park, the manufacturing campus Eastman was building on the northern edge of Rochester along the Genesee River, already employed 15,000 workers and covered more than a square mile of industrial ground. The first United States government contract came in 1917, aerial reconnaissance film for the American Expeditionary Forces deployed in France during the First World War. The United States Army Signal Corps standardized on Kodak film for aerial photography for the duration of the conflict. It would not be the last government contract, and it would not be the last war. But underneath the growth, underneath the government contracts and the factory expansions, and the global brand recognition, the Kodak business model carried a structural assumption that would prove in time to be its single point of failure. Every dollar Kodak earned depended on one thing: that Americans would always need film. The product that defined what Kodak was, not merely what it sold, but what it meant to American photographers for 7 decades, was not a camera. It was a strip of film. Kodachrome was introduced in 1935. It was a color reversal film, a film type that, when processed, produced a positive color transparency rather than a negative. The photographer loaded the camera shot the roll, mailed it to a Kodak processing laboratory, and received back a yellow cardboard box of mounted slides, 2 by 2-inch glass and cardboard frames, each holding a color image sharp enough to project at 10 feet on a screen and still resolve the individual threads in a man's suit jacket. No competing color film available in 1935 could match Kodachrome's color accuracy, its resolving sharpness, or the long-term stability of its dye layers. German Agfacolor film, introduced the same year, faded to an orange cast within a decade of processing. Kodachrome slides from 1936 retain their original color values today, in many cases more accurately than photographs taken on color negative film manufactured in the 1990s. The reason was the K14 process, the proprietary chemical development sequence that Kodak designed specifically for Kodachrome, and that could be performed only at Kodak-licensed processing laboratories. K14 was not a formula competitors could reverse engineer, because the dye layers in Kodachrome film were not incorporated into the emulsion during manufacturing. They were introduced chemically during processing itself, a technical inversion so counterintuitive that it took Kodak's own chemists years to perfect and that no competing manufacturer ever fully replicated. The consequence was a film of such archival permanence that the Wilhelm Imaging Research Institute rated properly stored Kodachrome at 100 years of stable color rendition, compared to 15 to 25 years for the leading competing color negative films of the same era. This was Kodak's moat, not the camera, not the brand name, the chemistry and the processing network that only Kodak controlled. National Geographic magazine adopted Kodachrome as its official editorial film in 1936 and did not substantially deviate from it for the next 71 years. Life magazine's photographers shot Kodachrome for color work from the publication's first issue in 1936 through its print run. The United States Department of the Interior used Kodachrome for its official documentation of American national parks beginning in the late 1930s. The United States Army Air Forces shot aerial reconnaissance on Kodak film stock throughout the Second World War, across every theater of operation, the Pacific, North Africa, and the European front. And in November 1963, the 26-second home movie that captured the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas, shot by dressmaker Abraham Zapruder on a Bell and Howell Zoomatic Director Series camera, was recorded on Kodachrome 2 film, rated at ASA 25. It was processed at the Kodak laboratory in Dallas the same afternoon. The color accuracy and archival stability of that film stock is the reason the footage remains forensically usable more than 60 years later. In 1963, the same year, Kodak introduced the Instamatic camera and the 126 cartridge film format. The Instamatic was not a technically sophisticated instrument. Its lens was a fixed-focus meniscus element, a single curved piece of optical glass rather than a compound precision design. Its shutter offered 2 speeds. Its viewfinder was a small rectangle of molded plastic. What the Instamatic offered was something no technical specification could fully capture. Its film cartridge dropped into the camera body without threading, without darkroom loading, and without any prior photographic experience. Its flash cube, a self-contained 4-sided flash unit, required no synchronization cable, no exposure calculation, and no knowledge of guide numbers. A child could load it, a grandparent could fire it in a living room on Christmas morning without reading the instructions. The Instamatic retailed at $15.95 in 1963, approximately $160 in current purchasing power. The nearest Japanese competitor in the 35mm format, the Olympus Pen EE half-frame camera, retailed at $37. The Leica M3, the German rangefinder that represented the pinnacle of available 35mm technology, retailed at $298. Kodak sold 7.5 million Instamatic cameras in the first 12 months of production. More cameras in a single year than the entire American camera industry had sold in any previous decade. The name on the film cartridge was not a city of origin. It was a chemical standard and a guarantee of recurring revenue that would underwrite Kodak Park, underwrite Rochester, and underwrite 60,000 American careers for the next 30 years. Until the day it didn't. By 1976, Eastman Kodak Company held 90% of the American photographic film market and 85% of the American camera market. No American consumer company of the 20th century outside of Standard Oil, before its court-ordered dissolution, had held a more commanding position in its industry for a longer continuous period of time. The numbers deserve a moment of stillness. 900 million rolls of photographic film produced annually at Kodak Park, a single manufacturing campus covering 2 square miles on the eastern bank of the Genesee River in Rochester, New York, 60,000 employees in Rochester alone. A research division, Kodak Research Laboratories, that employed more doctoral chemists and physicists than any private institution in the United States outside of Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey. A manufacturing capability so comprehensively integrated that Kodak produced its own optical glass, its own chemical precursors, its own packaging materials, and its own processing chemistry on the same campus within a half-mile radius of each other from raw material to finished product without a single outside supplier touching the critical path. The institutional client list was not a marketing roster. It was an inventory of American public life. The United States Army Signal Corps had standardized on Kodak film for military photography since the First World War. In the Second World War, every accredited American military photographer deployed in every theater of operation, the Pacific Islands, the North African desert, the hedgerows of Normandy, shot on Kodak film stock. On June 6, 1944, the D-Day landings at Omaha Beach were documented on Kodak Super XX panchromatic film ASA 100 by photographers from the Army Signal Corps and by Life magazine contract photographers including Robert Capa, whose surviving frames from the water's edge that morning remain among the most studied images in the history of American photojournalism. NASA used Kodak film in the Hasselblad cameras carried aboard every Apollo mission. The photographs of the lunar surface taken by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on July 20, 1969, were recorded on Kodak Kodachrome film and processed at the NASA Photo Laboratory at the Johnson Space Center in Houston using Kodak chemistry. The images that showed humanity standing on another world for the first time were made possible in part by a film emulsion manufactured in Rochester, New York. The Associated Press and United Press International wire services standardized on Kodak Tri-X film, a black and white emulsion rated at ASA 400, introduced in 1954 for press photography throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Tri-X was the film that allowed American photojournalists to work in available light without flash in courtrooms and at political conventions inside hospital emergency rooms and on factory floors at shutter speeds, fast enough to freeze motion in conditions where no earlier film stock could have produced a usable negative. And it was on Kodak film that the 2 photographs most credited with altering American public opinion on the Vietnam War were made. Eddie Adams's image of General Nguyen Ngoc Loan executing a Viet Cong prisoner on a Saigon street on February 1, 1968, was shot on Kodak Tri-X. Nick Ut's photograph of 9-year-old Kim Phuc running from a napalm strike on Route 1 near Trong Bang on June 8, 1972, was shot on Kodak film. The photographs that changed American policy were developed from chemistry manufactured in Rochester, New York. The shutter did not know it was American, the film did not care. But the city that made both understood at some level what it had built. Every American public school system that participated in the federal audio-visual education programs of the 1960s and 1970s operated Kodak slide projectors, the Carousel. 800 and its predecessors in classrooms from kindergarten through high school. The Carousel's circular tray held 80 slides and advanced them on a gravity feed mechanism so reliable that a projector purchased in 1965 could still be running in 1990 without a single service call. The United States Office of Education estimated in 1971 that more than 85% of American school districts used Kodak projection equipment for instructional programming. A generation of American students learned American history, earth science, and foreign languages from images projected through a Kodak lens onto a pull-down screen at the front of a classroom. National Geographic shot Kodachrome from 1936 to 2007, 71 consecutive years. The magazine's signature color palette, the warmth of its skin tones, and the particular luminosity of equatorial light rendered in afternoon sun was not an editorial decision made in a New York office. It was a chemical one made in a Rochester laboratory. It was the K14 die set. It was the Genesee River Basin. It was Kodak. There is a sound that anyone who sat in a darkened living room, a church fellowship hall, or a corporate conference room in the 1970s can reproduce from memory without effort. The soft clunk of the Kodak Carousel magazine rotating to the next position. The brief white rectangle of projected light on the screen before the slide dropped into the gate, the faint tick of the mechanism seating the frame, the momentary blur as someone's hand reached for the remote control. And then sharp. A family standing in front of the Grand Canyon in August 1971. A corporate quarterly report projected in a hotel ballroom in Cincinnati. A congregation retreat at a summer camp in Wisconsin, 1978, every face slightly overexposed in the afternoon light because the photographer had forgotten to adjust the aperture. The Kodak Carousel projector was not a precision instrument in the way that a Leica rangefinder was a precision instrument. It was a domestic one. It was the machine that made American memory legible to the people who had lived it, projected on a bedsheet tacked to a wall in a living room in Ohio in August, with the windows closed and the air conditioning turned off so the image would show clearly on the fabric. The smell in that room was the faint chemical warmth of a projector lamp heating a cardboard film mount that had spent 8 months in a shoebox. The sound was the cooling fan running between slides. The light was Kodachrome, warm, specific, irreplaceable. In 1970, Kodak's annual advertising budget in the United States exceeded the combined total annual revenue of the 20 largest American camera importers. The Kodak retail display, the yellow and red film boxes arranged by ASA rating and film type behind the locked glass counter of every camera store. Every drugstore and every department store in America was so visually embedded in American commercial life that consumer research conducted in 1978 found that American shoppers could identify the Kodak color scheme at a distance with greater accuracy than the color combination of the American flag. Rochester itself had a population of approximately 295,000 people in 1976. 1 in 5 Rochester residents worked for Kodak. The local economy, its hotels, its restaurants, its real estate market, its secondary manufacturing base, its retail districts was built on a single operating assumption that Kodak would always be there. That assumption was not irrational. Kodak had been in Rochester for nearly 90 years. It had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Korean War, and the social upheavals of the 1960s without recording a single year of operating losses. It had, in 1975, invented the technology that would destroy it, and it had made a choice. Stephen Sisson was 24 years old in the fall of 1975 when he built the first digital camera inside the Kodak apparatus division in Rochester. He used a Fairchild CCD, a charge-coupled device, a semiconductor chip that converted light into electrical signals rather than triggering a chemical reaction in a silver halide emulsion mounted inside a housing assembled from components available in the Kodak stockroom. A Motorola digital signal processor handled the image data. A portable cassette tape drive recorded it. The assembled device weighed 8 pounds and produced a black and white image 100 pixels wide and 100 pixels tall. It required 23 seconds to write a single image to tape. When Sasson demonstrated the prototype to his supervisors, they filed the patent United States Patent Number 4131919 issued December 26, 1978, and told him to put it away. The reasoning as Sasson described it in a 2007 interview was direct and not without its own internal logic. If this technology worked at consumer scale, it would eliminate the need for photographic film. Kodak's film division was generating more than $2 billion in annual revenue. The Qualx photo finishing division, Kodak's network of consumer film processing laboratories, was processing approximately 1 billion rolls of film per year at its operational peak. That revenue underwrote Kodak Park, it underwrote Rochester, it underwrote the salaries, pensions, and healthcare benefits of 60,000 American workers. The calculation was rational. The conclusion was fatal. The first external warning arrived in 1981 when Sony introduced the Mavica magnetic video camera, a device that captured still images on a small magnetic floppy disk and displayed them on a standard television monitor. The Mavica was not a consumer product. It was a prototype demonstration of proof of concept shown at a Tokyo press conference. But Kodak's internal market research division commissioned a study the same year. The study's conclusion, later cited in a Harvard Business School case study on Kodak's strategic failure, was unambiguous. Digital photography would be commercially viable within 10 years and would fundamentally restructure the consumer film market within 20. Kodak's response to that finding was a film format. In 1982, Kodak introduced the disc camera, a thin, pocket-sized device that used a rotating disc of 15 film frames rather than a conventional film strip. The disc camera was engineered to be thinner than the Instamatic, more convenient than the 110 cartridge format it was intended to replace, and difficult for Japanese manufacturers to duplicate because Kodak held the relevant production patents. What it was not engineered to be was competitive on image quality. The usable film area on a disc frame was less than half the size of a standard 35 mm negative. Grain was visible at standard enlargement sizes, color rendition was acceptable at small print dimensions, and degraded rapidly beyond 4 by 6 inches. Consumer rejection was swift and categorical. Kodak discontinued the disc camera format by 1988, $1.4 billion invested. 3 years of active market presence, no lasting consumer adoption, no strategic ground gained. The wrong problem solved expensively on the wrong timeline. Meanwhile, the competitors Kodak should have been watching most closely were not slowing down. In 1984, Canon demonstrated the RC701, the first commercially marketed electronic still camera designed for professional use at the Summer Olympic Games in Los Angeles. The RC701 captured images on a small magnetic disc and transmitted them by standard telephone line to newspaper offices in real time. The Associated Press deployed the system to cover the games. Images shot in Los Angeles appeared in newsrooms in New York and Chicago within minutes of the shutter firing. The Associated Press was a Kodak customer. The images transmitted from Los Angeles that summer contained no Kodak film. They never would again. Canon had no film revenue to protect. Nikon had no film revenue to protect. Sony had no film revenue to protect. Each of those companies could invest in digital sensor technology without calculating what it would cost their existing business model. They invested without restraint, without the institutional hesitation that comes from watching $2 billion in annual revenue standing directly in the path of the technology you are being asked to fund. Kodak could not make the same choice, not without dismantling the economic foundation of an entire American city. In 1994, Kodak introduced the Photo CD, a system for scanning developed film negatives and storing the resulting digital files on a compact disc that could be viewed on a computer monitor or a television screen equipped with a compatible player. It was a bridge technology continue shooting film, digitize the results after processing, access the images electronically without abandoning the film workflow entirely. Photo CD was technically sophisticated and commercially unsuccessful. The consumer market was not looking for a bridge. It was looking for a camera that produced a digital file directly without film, without processing, and without a separate scanning step that added cost and time to every roll shot. In 1996, Kodak joined Fujifilm, Canon, Nikon, and Minolta in introducing the advanced photo system. APS, a new film format using a smaller cartridge equipped with a magnetic data strip that communicated exposure information directly to processing laboratories, enabling automatic print sizing and simplified reordering. APS was the most coordinated industry attempt to extend the commercial life of consumer film photography. It lasted 6 years in active market distribution before the accelerating adoption of digital cameras rendered the entire format category commercially irrelevant. Kodak had spent a decade and several $billion attempting to solve the problem of consumer convenience within a film-based framework. The market had already decided that the framework itself was the problem. In 1995, Kodak introduced the DC-40 digital camera. It produced images at 756 by 504 pixels, well under half a megapixel by modern measurement. It retailed at $995. It required a personal computer and proprietary software to download and view images. It was positioned as a tool for business professionals, not as a consumer product. It was underinvested, undermarketed, and underpowered relative to what Canon and Sony were already preparing to bring to market. In 2001, Kodak launched the EasyShare system, a line of consumer digital cameras paired with desktop docking stations that simplified image transfer and printing. The system was well-designed, competitively priced, and genuinely easy to use. For a moment, it appeared that Kodak had found its footing in the digital market. By 2005, Kodak was the best-selling digital camera brand in the United States. Number 1. American, digital, Kodak. It was by any measure a remarkable recovery, and it arrived approximately 18 months before everything changed again. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and announced a device he described as a phone, a music player, and an internet communicator. It was also a camera. By 2008, smartphone cameras were outselling standalone digital cameras in the United States for the first time. By 2010, Kodak's consumer digital camera division was losing money on every unit it sold. By 2011, Kodak employed fewer than 17,000 workers worldwide, down from 60,000 in Rochester alone a generation earlier. On January 19, 2012, Eastman Kodak Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. 124 years after George Eastman produced his first dry plate emulsion on the 3rd floor of a building at 343 State Street in Rochester. 37 years after Stephen Sasson built the first digital camera in Building 28 and was told to put it away. In Rochester that morning, the Kodak Tower still rose above the city skyline. The yellow sign at its summit was still illuminated. It went dark 3 years later. The cameras are still out there. In estate sales in Rochester and Columbus and Portland and Tucson, in the photography section wedged between the 8-track players and the electric typewriters, there are yellow and red Kodak film boxes, some still factory sealed, some already exposed and never developed the latent images inside them, waiting on a chemical process that no longer exists at any price in any city within 100 miles. There are Kodak Carousel 800 projectors with their circular trays still loaded, 80 slides per tray from a church congregation retreat in 1983, from a corporate training session in a Holiday Inn conference room in 1977, from a family vacation to the Grand Canyon in the summer of 1971. The projectors sell on eBay for $40 to $100. They sell within days of listing because somewhere in America, someone still has a shoebox of slides that need projecting, and the carousel mechanism built in Rochester to manufacturing tolerances held within 1/1000th of an inch still runs without complaint after 50 years of occasional use. Kodak Tri-X black and white film is still in production. Kodak Ektar 100 color negative film is still in production. Both are manufactured at Kodak Park in Rochester, a campus built to support 60,000 workers that now employs fewer than 2,000 its older buildings, standing empty along the Genesee River, like the physical memory of an industrial scale that will not return. The Film Photography Project, a podcast and online community founded in the United States in 2009, has documented a measurable resurgence of film photography among photographers, under 35 photographers born after the Kodak Instamatic was discontinued who learned to compose and expose on digital cameras, who now load Tri-X into Nikon FM2 bodies and develop it in Kodak D76 developer in their bathroom sinks, timing the process on a phone manufactured by the company whose product made film photography commercially obsolete. The George Eastman Museum at 900 East Avenue in Rochester, New York, the world's oldest photography museum, housed in the mansion George Eastman built and lived in until his death in 1932, maintains the largest collection of photographic history anywhere on Earth: 400,000 photographs, 28,000 films, and 4 million individual items of historical photographic equipment and documentation. Among those 4 million items is Stephen Sisson's original 1975 digital camera prototype. For decades after its construction, the prototype was considered lost. Following Kodak's Chapter 11 filing in January 2012, as teams worked through the company's intellectual property holdings and physical assets in preparation for bankruptcy proceedings, a group sorting through the Kodak Research Laboratory's archive located the device in a storage facility on the Rochester campus. It was intact. It was functional. It was still capable of capturing a 100 by 100 pixel image on a magnetic cassette tape, 23 seconds per frame, exactly as it had been on the December afternoon in 1975 when Sisson first showed it to his supervisors and was told to put it away. The prototype now sits in a display case at the George Eastman Museum, 3 miles from the laboratory where Sisson built it inside the home of the man who founded the company that invented the camera the company chose not to commercialize. What is harder to place in a display case is everything else that disappeared. The darkroom technician who could read a photographic test strip under orange safelight, who could look at a strip of paper developed for 90 seconds in Kodak Dectol and know from the density and separation of its gray tones alone whether the enlarger timer needed adjusting by 5 seconds, is no longer a professional category in the United States. The Kodak color chemist, who managed film emulsion consistency to a tolerance measured in microns across a production run of 900 million linear feet of film stock, is no longer a professional category. The Qualex photo finishing counter employee, who matched skin tones on color prints by eye, holding the print to the fluorescent light above the counter, adjusting the color balance dial on the Kodak Minilab printer by accumulated experience rather than by instruction, is no longer a professional category. These were American working careers with 30-year trajectories, union contracts, defined benefit pension plans, and bodies of practical knowledge that took years of daily repetition to build and cannot be recovered from any archive or reconstructed from any manual. They did not retire. They were made obsolete. The last roll of Kodachrome in the world was processed at Duane's Photo in Parsons, Kansas on December 30th, 2010. It had been shot by National Geographic photographer Steve McCurry. The lab's owner, Grant Steinle, processed it himself. The K14 chemistry that developed it, the proprietary dye sequence that Kodak chemists spent decades refining to the point where a slide made in 1937 could still be projected in 2010 without detectable color shift, no longer exists in production form anywhere on Earth. The Kodachrome color palette, its particular rendering of American afternoon light, the warmth of its yellows, the specific quality of shadow detail in its darker tones, is now available as a free download. A Lightroom preset called Viesco Kodachrome 64, distributed on photography websites and downloaded by photographers who were born after the last roll was processed. The chemistry that took 70 years to perfect now runs as lines of code on a laptop. In a display case in the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York, there is a Kodak Brownie No. 2, manufactured in 1901. It was priced originally at $2. The film chamber still carries the faint chemical trace of a century of loaded rolls, the ghost of silver halide and cellulose acetate of family vacations and front porch portraits, and Sunday afternoons in backyards that no longer exist in any form except the photographs made in them. The shutter fires. No one loads it anymore. America built the camera that recorded a century of its own life. America made every roll of film that ran through it. The company that did both invented the technology that ended the era and calculated in a Rochester laboratory in 1975 that the cost of the future was higher than the value of the present. It was a reasonable calculation. It was the last one Kodak ever got wrong. If that history matters to you, the companies, the cameras, the film, and what was lost when they went subscribe. Every week there is another one of these stories. Another American brand, another city, another calculation that seemed reasonable at the time. The next one is already in production.